and perhaps suggest an agenda or at least a reality that design and designers must carry forward as our species enters or maybe comes to understand the way of being in relation to one another, to our institutions, to our planet, and to the many entities that we share with it. The title of my talk is Design is the Answer, but What Was the Question? This is a hat tip to the British architect Cedric Price, who asked in 1996, technology is the answer, but what is the question? Of course, he is still correct in asking this question, perhaps now more than ever. But I think the question applies to design as well. This is because the stories we have told ourselves about design, about the world, and therefore the stories that shape our design logics, in many ways no longer hold true. We are living in a time of discontinuity where the future will not predictably share features of our present or our past. Most notably, the Holocene climate that our species has thrived within for millennia has already disappeared. So design and designers are confronted with a new and sometimes unknowable set of questions. But we are also looking into an era of almost total redesign. Redesign of our organizations, our institutions, our capabilities, our alliances, our protocols, our communities, ourselves, and the relational dynamics that shape the interplay between all of these things. And we heard this on this panel just a moment ago. There's the need to even design the fundamental story of ourselves and our nations. This is an era of design on a grand scale. This is design for planetary scale challenges. This is design for planetarity. So this talk, given its scope, cannot possibly be comprehensive. It's just an appetizer. I'll put a few concepts on the table, but we'll have to get into the main courses in future design summits. Some of what I'm sharing today is part of a network set of research initiatives that we are undertaking at the Center for Complexity under the frame of the Polyscene, and are captured here or on our website at polyscene.design. Our intent for this work is to advance a body of knowledge around design and creative practices that are equipped for this new planetary epoch we find ourselves already now several decades into. This is also an invitation to all of you. If you have interest, reach out to us, make some sort of contribution to it, challenge it, adapt it to your own purposes. By my definition, the Polyscene is indeed an era of many, and we all have a role to play. And I want to begin by modeling what I believe to be a core capability of design practice that makes us especially useful in this era, and that is epistemic humility. That is simply that I am comfortable and confident in the fact that there are things that I don't know, that my knowledge structures, both internally constructed and externally validated, are limited and are the product of a certain time, of a certain Western traditions in particular, certain ways of knowing, and a massively long list of untested assumptions and biases. And I'm here in a sense by accident. It could and should be any of you, especially the students in the room, that has every right and capability to speak from this lectern. But even though I'm here by accident and by privilege, I still have something that I'd like to add. So I ask for your permission in hopes of building a relational ethic and a relational intelligence between us. As we venture into the complex unknowns of our task, we seek permission not just from the human realm, but from the earth, the non-human, and the ancestors. We recognize that we are not separate entities, but are rather embedded in a web of relationships that extend beyond our own selves. We acknowledge that the pervasive rhetoric of rational modernity that separates mind, body, humans from nature, and self from other is rooted in the logic of coloniality, and commit to moving beyond this limiting perspective to honor the inherent value of complex relationships that bind us together. May we co-create with sincerity, guided by the wisdom of our collective experiences as we shape a future that celebrates unity, harmony, and interconnectedness. So, design is the answer, but what was the question? In a sense, I think the question is very simple. What do we do now? Just as a shopkeeper might tell an inattentive patron, you break it, you own it, we've broken this planetary system, and now we own it. This is also why I think design is the answer. Our task now is to design our way out of this mess, or to put it in Samuel Beckett's terms, to find a form that accommodates the mess. That is the task of the designer now. For me, this is an immensely powerful remit for design. Not only does it empower us with a role and orientation to the Polyscene, it relieves us of the modernist demand that there be no mess, that everything must be uniform, controlled, bounded, and knowable. And accommodating the mess provides us a pathway toward decoloniality and equity, toward decentering the human, toward remaking the relationship between human and non-human entities. Of course, we didn't really choose this path. Our best idea and most dominant assumption for the last 40 years is what Alex Steffen and many others have called the orderly transition. That is that humanity could find a way to abandon the incredibly cheap force multiplier that is fossil fuels, upon which our economies, governance, structures, our food systems, and so much more are built, and just smoothly transition into some other organizational system without changing that much at all at the end of the day. In retrospect, the orderly transition was never a viable pathway, despite the hard work of many, myself included, in trying to design it. And this graph testifies to that truth. How many in here have seen this graph before? Are we familiar with this? So do you understand basically what's happening on the graph? We have concentration of carbon emissions on a line like this. We have increase above mean temperatures, and then we have the institutional response plotted to that curve, right? So we have the preliminary IPCC gatherings, 1979. So this is a graph of carbon emissions. It's a graph of mean temperature rise, but it's also a graph of institutional crisis and collapse. In other words, our institutions are not up for this task. And the result is that the planet's biophysical limits have been hit. There's no slack left in this planetary system to absorb our mistakes that stem from complexity avoidance, from reductionism, from short-term thinking, all of the hallmarks of modernism. In other words, there is no pathway that is not self-terminating for our species to avoid complexity and fundamental redesign of everything from our epistemologies to systems of value exchange. There is no pathway that does not include redesign. I want to make a distinction here that I do not see before us apocalyptic collapse as we understand it from Hollywood. That's not our fate. Tomorrow will indeed look a lot like today. But over shorter and shorter time frames, we will see more and more change as a result of the technologies we have deployed, from combustion engines to AI. In a sense, the central task of design might be to help humanity choose between a set of bad options over what it will be an enduring emergency, or at least choose among options for which there is no clear winner. This means that complexity is the unavoidable context surrounding all of our decision-making. Even when decisions seem simple, given the degree of interconnectedness of our systems, of production, of value, of meaning, simple decisions have complex downstream impacts. Most of these impacts we do not account for. Unaccounted for impacts are also known as externalities. 2 centuries or more of accumulating externalities have pushed us beyond the safe operating limits of the planet. And as a result, we live in a kind of wilderness. But this is not the ancient wilderness of our ancestors. It is a new wilderness of our own making. We see this with climate change, certainly, but we also encounter the wilderness in our technologies, most significantly artificial intelligence, as has been discussed throughout this conference. Rather than finding comfort in a safe harbor, we need to accommodate the fact that we are indeed at a frontier. This is a frontier of our ability to know, and therefore our ability to predict or make assumptions. This is a big deal. We all rely on assumptions to navigate our lives every day. Governments and institutions do the very same. I was struck the other day by a headline in the New York Times that reminded me that Joe Biden's electoral promise to Americans was a return to normal. But the world has done nothing to cooperate in this fantasy of the normal. This is an image of bicycles left on the Russian side of the border with Finland by migrants escaping violence and lack of opportunity, but supported or at least ignored by Russia as a way to increase political pressure inside Finland and Europe. These bicycles are an artifact of planetary geographies. Finland will have to design a response due to its proximity, but given its configuration as a sovereign state, this will only treat the symptoms. The real causes are complex and dynamic and lie outside the governance capacity and knowledge systems of any individual Finnish administrative body. Meanwhile, our ability to know is evolving too. With more knowledge comes more complexity. This is an image from NASA of the constellation Cygnus on a 2.5-minute exposure. What are those lines separating us from the stars? It's Starlink satellites deployed by the thousands into low Earth orbit. This is an artifact of what Benjamin Bratton calls planetary sapience. We are developing an exoskeleton tech that shapes how we know what we know. He says the most important social impact of some technologies is not just in what they allow people to do, but in what they reveal about how the world works. With each new revelation comes the demand, or at least opportunity, then for redesign. Everybody remember this? In a world that is deeply interconnected across technical, social, and human biological domains, and where complexity is indeed the context, uncertainty also reigns. This is a wilderness where the probabilities that we once used to make sense of the present and attempt to predict the future no longer pencil out. The maths of these probabilities no longer works. But I'm not here to cause despair. The lack of probabilities is just another way of describing conditions that are necessary for change, right? Uncertainty is a condition that allows novelty, allows something new to happen. I would argue that uncertainty is a precondition for human agency. When there's uncertainty, we have a choice. We can make a choice. And as ethical designers and agents of change ourselves, the opportunity for pro-social change is what we seek. So in other words, this moment of profound uncertainty is also a moment of profound opportunity for us as designers and for us as humans to make decisions about the future. I've mentioned epistemology several times so far. It's a fancy word, I recognize that. This is sort of an academic conference. It's also sort of a design conference. We at the center bridge those two worlds. But it's critical to our work at the Center for Complexity because we recognize that many of the negative outcomes we encounter in healthcare, in governance, or global security are fundamentally a product of what we and others call epistemological error. That is an error in how we as individuals, or society through its institutions and academic traditions, have constructed knowledge about something. Our practice at the CFC, Center for Complexity, is to identify epistemological errors, attempt to construct better ways of knowing, right? Make some better knowledge if the ones we have are failing, and design interventions based on a hypothesis about some improved epistemology, a better way of knowing a problem set. I believe this to be a critical competency for designers who are working in the Polyscene or in any problem space. But ultimately, it pits two worldviews against each other, one of certainty and causality, and the other of uncertainty and lack of probabilities. And the Vice Chancellor was just speaking to this reality, right? That we have higher education systems that are very good at producing linear thinkers, but that's not the world that we live in. The figureheads, at least from my Western context, for this epistemological boxing match, let's call it, might be Isaac Newton and the economist Frank Knight. Where Isaac Newton advanced our scientific knowledge through describing phenomena deterministically, Frank Knight, who is really the only kind of economist that I would like, had a different worldview, one where there are some limits to what is knowable. And these limits introduce uncertainty as an inherent feature of virtually any problem set. So here we sit at a moment from transition in a moment of transition from Newtonian mechanics to what's called Knightian uncertainty. Transitions are uncomfortable, I get that, but are spaces of incredible opportunity, especially for those of us trained to seek openings that make new realities possible. That is indeed one definition of design. We can see evidence of the transition in this key diagram by Stuart Brand. Who here has encountered this diagram at some point in their lives? No, not familiar. Okay, interesting. You should look at it. It's called the pace layers diagram. Brand set out and drew this diagram in 1999 to describe how change moves unevenly among different domains. In his model, nature is slowest to change, while fashion changes rapidly. Commerce connected to fashion must move at a pace that enables fashion to come in and out of favor, but the business remains stable, right? So think about denim or jeans. From skinny jeans to wide pants and back again, Levi's, the company still remains, but the fashion changes. Between nature and commerce are slower moving domains such as governance, institutions, and the cultures on which they rest. Brand's diagram from late in the last century decidedly is a Holocene idea. This describes a world in which nature is almost unchanging. This is the world of poetry, of ideas, of agricultural systems, where nature is immutable. This is also a world that is obviously no more. Change is changing differently now. This is my redrawing of Brand's pace layers. In this redrawing, nature is moving fast, faster than our culture is able to understand and adopt to. Nature is outpacing our infrastructure. Think of any city around the world facing water challenges, and we know this to be true. And certainly nature is moving faster than our institutions and systems of governance. Our politics are not prepared for this disruption in the patterns of change. So this diagram describes the Anthropocene, or what we call the Polycene. Here, change operates according to different logic than it has for most of human history. And therefore, the assumptions we hold about change, how change happens, are undermined. This is a kind of discontinuity. The past and the future, therefore, run on a different kind of code. And our challenge is that how we think about the world hasn't changed quickly enough to keep up with the pace of nature. As Alex Steffen says, we are not yet ready for what has already happened. Our task now is to find ways of updating how we see, how we understand, how we describe, and how we design to match what has already happened. Okay, I don't do all the talking in my talks. Now it's time for you all to talk. So, what do you see? Who said an orange? Come on. How do you know it's an apple? Or an orange? Schema? Is that what I heard? Yeah, good. Other thoughts? How do we know it's an apple? What is the difference between these two apples? It's a reflection, are you sure? Okay, what if I do this? What's the difference between these two apples? Healthier, we think. Marketing, yeah. I heard something else. Organic farming, is that what somebody said? Okay, so the supply chains that create these things are different. What else? Okay, so there's some economics at play that distinguishes these two apples. Yeah, so there's a kind of brand and perception, quality perception. What else? That's it. Sorry? One's AI created, maybe, it's printed. So what I did here was quite simple, right? I showed you something that you're incredibly familiar with and is therefore hard to access, to understand what it is actually. But by showing you the same thing with a different label, suddenly we're able to open up the deeper complexity of that very simple object, right? And so these are different dimensions that describe that complexity. There's a political dimension to apples, at least in my country. There's a kind of blue leaning, leftward leaning toward organics and rightward leaning rejection of organics. There's a material difference. You suggested nutrition, right? There's probably a material difference to these. The context in which they're generated is different. Labor, tech, how we eat these and consume them and feel about that consumption. The bodily is different. The economic is different. Absolutely, the historical and epistemological are different. So this is not just an apple, though we like to think it is. It is a tangled network of meaning. There is knowledge and tension and power dynamics that are playing out in this apple. So what we did here is a kind of microcosm of the work that we have to do across all fields of play, and especially in design. We've taken an object that we treat as an object that's self-contained. What we did by labeling it organic is to say, well, maybe there's actually a flow at play here, right? Maybe there's a nutritional difference, there's an economic difference, there's a brand and perception difference. These are kind of flow states that come in and out of effect on that apple. Once we added these other elements to it, then we got closer to what is the truth, which is that even something as simple as an apple is actually a knot. It's a knot of tangled meaning, right? So that knot, that tangled meaning is largely invisible to us. That is a kind of information asymmetry that our modern world creates for us, where we can't perceive the depth and true nature of the complexity that makes that organic apple possible or non-organic apple possible. So this exercise of moving from fixed closed objects to flows to knotted states is kind of core for this work. One more piece of work for you to do. What percentage of the cells in our body are human in origin? Any guesses? Do I need to ask again? What percentage of the cells in our body, total cells, are human in origin? All right? All of them? Okay, that's a guess. None of them. We have an alien in the room. Human in origin. 99%? 5%. Okay, we have an alien, we have a quasi-human. It's between 1 and 100. That is true. No. Nice try. 70? Okay, so the answer is, of all of the cells in our human body, 43% are created by us. The rest come from outside into our bodies, that's known as our biome, or they exist on our skin. So we are in fact only 43% human by cell count. Weird idea, right? But what does that mean about us as people? We are not these solitary fixed organisms. We ourselves are actually flow states. We ourselves are actually these tangled knots of meaning, just as that apple was. So we are 43% human. So this kind of reality, this is just like the planetary sapience argument, this deeper understanding of the true complexity of the world in which we inhabit will reshape, or gives us the opportunity to reshape how we design the products, services. I mean, think about human-centered design. If we're only 43% human, what is human-centered design? Is that mostly in service of organisms that come from elsewhere in our body. So maybe that's disturbing for some of you. I encourage you to think about that, reflect on that for a while. It gets more disturbing the more that you think about it. So what does this all mean for the practice of design? I've taken some inspiration recently from Nora Bateson's great book called Combining, where she says that the shape of the response needs to meet, not match, the shape of the trouble. From experience, I know that much of what I have said in this talk can seem very much overwhelming, especially to a young designer trying to figure out their path. How is it, they often ask me, can I manage this complexity that I know from lived experience to be true, but for which my education has not prepared me? And I think Nora offers us an ambition or an orientation to a practice that is aligned with complexity, where trying to match the complexity or scale of a problem such as climate change is overwhelming and indeed impossible for any single actor or organization. Meeting the shape of the trouble demands that we try to understand rather than to control, that we remain in a posture of learning and humility, that we act opportunistically rather than forcefully. Meeting, not matching the shape of the trouble is an ethos for design practice going forward. Meeting, not matching the shape of the trouble requires us to work at a conceptual level. We must understand something at a phenomenological level. We must understand how it relates to and is interrelated with other things. We must understand why it is the way it is. We must understand its history, just like that apple. But we are also designers who are tasked with making something. To make something requires a technical specification. A chair should have 4 legs, or 2 in the case of these, be made of wood or metal and plastic in the case of these, and have a cushion, for instance. And I would argue that the conceptual frame and the technical specification, these things do not need to be in opposition. That in fact, the better we are able to frame the conceptual, the better we are able to create the technical. Our framework that we use to describe this continuum between the conceptual and the technical is called the Steinberg funnel, after a longtime collaborator and professor of mine, Marco Steinberg. So it basically works like this. Imagine this is a funnel. And on the left side of the funnel, there's the world of the infinite, an infinite set of choices or infinite choice set. And on the right-hand side, you have a choice set of 1, right? So the chair is either going to have 4 legs or 2. So this end is the domain of the technical problem or the technical specification. And this open end is the domain of the conceptual problem. And what we do, whether we know it or not as designers, and what designers are trained to do in most studio settings, is to find ways of moving between that conceptual and technical frame. That if say we're working on an issue like designing a chair, there is a point in the studio and in the brief where we question the nature of sitting. Why is it that we want to sit? Where do we want to sit? And what kind of climate do we want to sit? These are conceptual questions for which the choice set is vast. But at the end of the day, we have to make a technical specification. We have to make a choice about that chair and what its nature is. And what we know too from studio and from this work is that this process is not linear or straightforward. It's sometimes recursive, sometimes we go backwards, sometimes we make progress in the conceptual domain, and we lose that as we try to apply it to the technical domain. And this is a kind of dynamic that plays out in design practice. But I think this is part of our great skill set as a community, is that we are able to work between the conceptual and the technical, whereas other fields operate fully within one of those two spaces, fully within the technical or fully within the conceptual. And in the conditions where complexity is context, that ability to work conceptually is absolutely critical. Another framework we deploy at the Center for Complexity is something we call Keep, Drop, Modify. And we do this a lot with our partners in government. When approaching any kind of design challenge, and assuming as we do that we are in a time of redesign, the designer can ask what do we want to keep, what do we want to drop, and what do we want to modify. This enables us to identify sources of value that should be preserved. These are the things to keep, to make decisions about what might be causing harm or negative outcomes. We drop these things. And to recognize opportunities for strategic improvement. This is to modify. It's a very simple framework, as all useful frameworks should be. But especially when we are working with non-design communities, as I said, in government or healthcare or similar fields defined by technical expertise, the framework allows our partners to easily engage in a redesign process. And so if our work is redesign at a vast scale, we have to engage with these technical communities at a very fundamental level across all problem domains. The Keep, Drop, Modify framework acknowledges that designers must work with non-designer communities, but the difficulty of designers working with non-designers should never be underestimated. Designers working at the frontier must cultivate a kind of relational intelligence. That is, we must build practices that consciously design the qualities of interactions between things, especially those things that are or have been separated by artificial boundaries. I call this designing alliances. We humans are uniquely capable of designing and constructing alliances, at least on this planet. It is perhaps our greatest superpower, and it is key to dissolving the artificial boundaries between us and our contexts. So what would it mean to design alliances between human and non-human entities? For instance, communities in a watershed designing an alliance with a river system that is transnational in nature. A city designing an alliance with its bioregion. Humans designing an alliance with products where the relation is not extractive or colonizing, but works toward mutual benefit. We've become adept at designing alliances within technical systems, like you see in this motorbike. But we must develop capabilities to design alliances between human and non-human systems. And I want to advocate for design alliances as a future theme for this design summit. There are many other areas of future design practice to explore, and this is outlined in our Polyscene work. So as I begin to close, I want to highlight just one of those, and this is a screen capture from our website. You can click on each one of these and it will lead to more text. I've mentioned before that our current predicament is a result of not attending to the externalities of our decisions. Most significantly, we have never accounted for the true costs of burning fossil fuels and the impact of carbon pollution. Externalities have come to mean harms caused by our decisions, but are a problem that we don't have to account for. But what would it mean to design with no externalities? How do we get better at designing for second, third, and nth order effects? How can we better anticipate negative outcomes? What are the tools and frameworks that help us generate collateral benefits of our decision-making, such as increasing social equity? I would argue that we can do this by operating within diverse and distributed relational systems. This means that as designers, we are placing expert knowledge on an equal footing with other ways of knowing, such as that of people with lived experience. We're doing this in a project right now on the opioid crisis in the US. We're not just talking to people with MDs, we're talking to people in long-term recovery, or people that have just entered recovery or who are still actively using drugs, because they know the problem set better than anyone else. Where this gets really exciting is when we find ways to include both human and non-human systems. This would mean that human inventions, such as borders and taxonomies, matter less in our decision-making, bringing us into closer alignment with a planetary worldview. In the short term, until we figure out how to design for no externalities, this means always designing to reduce harm, or at least this is my assertion, that what we must do now is to design in a way that reduces harm. First order harms are our direct responsibility as designers. Second and third order harms, at the very least, have to be anticipated. How can we do that? By including other ways of knowing. The quality of our ability to predict harms will be related to the quality of relational intelligence you have built through your design process. and what knowledge you have made instrumental via your design methodologies. So designing for no externalities is a long-term project. I think also Design Summit 02, no externalities, would be a great opportunity. I'm going to close, and I'd like to respond to Ijlal's critical framing for the event. You said everything that has been designed or will be designed is being designed now, exclamation point. Not yours, that was a later addition. But it needed force of will, right? Yeah. So I have been thinking a lot about this since I read it the first time. And I think it's really important. I also think it's partially true. I think if we accept that humanity is riding the wave of a one-time carbon pulse, that means we're going to burn all of these fossil fuels up in this one-time activity over centuries that makes materials, that makes manufacturing and movement really cheap, then I think, Ijla, I think you're right. We're not going to be able to keep this up, though. At some point, we will not have the resources or the capacity to design new things in the way that we are designing them now. And therefore, everything that will be designed is being designed now directly or indirectly by the logics, systems, and assumptions that exist now. If, however, I am right that the frontier of design practice is the design of alliances and that we are able to design without externalities, then I think there is an infinite frontier for design. One where design is able to answer new questions that we never thought to ask, questions that require new knowledge, new intelligence, new ways of being, and new ways of being in relationship with ourselves and with our planet. Humbly, I offer my rewrite of this framing. Everything that has been designed and will be designed, let me say that again. Everything that has been designed will be designed again. Thank you. I don't know if we have time. Questions, comments? You can send hate mail to jcook@risd.edu.
Thank you for that very enlightening talk. Just wanted to ask, so I think you've already mentioned that, but if you could relate how the design work fits into thriving as a species, how we could incorporate that into our daily or practical lives.
Can you ask that? It was kind of breaking up.
Right, sorry. So if you could advise us on, there were aspects of it in there, how we can incorporate the design, structuring design or designing, or thinking about design, incorporating it in thriving as a species, and how we can incorporate that into simple tasks of our daily lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes to, I think if there's anything we can make progress on, it's figuring out how to design with this notion of designing for no externalities. In other words, things that go unconsidered. But I think while that is an incredible kind of goal, I think it can become very quickly overwhelming, right? Because it's very hard for us to anticipate even second-order effects of the decisions that we make. But we're also sitting on an enormous amount of computational power that's on a log curve. So maybe at some point that will be a useful place for AI to be operative, which is we can actually anticipate second and third order, nth order impacts of the decisions that we make. So what is, I mentioned in the talk, what is that short-term solution? And I think it is to design from a perspective of harm reduction or harm mitigation. And I think the corollary of that, the benefit of that, is that it enables greater opportunity for thriving, right? It is harm caused by our decisions that limits our ability to thrive. So the short term is every design decision that I take, I need to make sure that it doesn't cause harm. And the better I am able to do that is, in my view, a product of who we involve in that design process, right? Those people that are using drugs, they have a stake, a real stake. And so we need to involve them in figuring out this public health crisis in the US. Other thoughts? Yeah.
So my question is that why is there so much, when we look at ideas such as artificial intelligence, essentially it's a mimicry of human intelligence. Then why there's so much otherness when we are having conversations about it? That artificial is something which is totally divorced from human intelligence, and it's something which is, I mean, you know, it's totally disconnected.
Yeah. I mean, I want to claim a degree of ignorance here, I think as everybody does, right? Because we don't really know yet. One of our new initiatives at the center is an AI impact lab where we'll try to bring the RISD community around understanding the impacts of these technologies. But I would just say that, you know, these large language models are vacuuming up a certain kind of intelligence. And it's mostly English, it's mostly Western, it's mostly written by white men, right? So that's a certain kind of intelligence. So I think that's still missing. I mean, it's sort of like what percentage of ourselves are human in nature. Like that is one tiny percentage of the intelligence that we have. I mean, we had the great comment, Pauline, by you, of how much intelligence is held in our hands, right? That kind of embodied intelligence is another form of intelligence. So, I mean, I think it's just one piece. I think where it gets scary is when the models can move into those territories. And I imagine, you know, the more that we sort of develop romantic relationships with these things, for instance, the more they'll move into those other domains of intelligence. And that'll get tricky quickly. But yeah, there's my favorite farmer poet in the US has a quote that says that we live in an age of divorce, and the task that we have in this age is to take two things that have been separated but belong together and put them back together. And the trick is in figuring out what those two things are. And so you said this thing about divorce, which I think is right. And I think part of our task is to figure out what has been artificially divorced through our academic traditions, through our institutions, and figure out how to bring those things back together and have a kind of more holistic worldview. I'm getting the evil eye. I should step off now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Justin. May I please now request Mr. Hasib Gardezi, Chief Operating Officer, Hospitality and Education Division at Hashu Group, who have collaborated with us for the food and design activity that you'll be seeing later today, to please come up on the stage and say a few words. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Mr. Rashid Rana and the team of BNU for this design summit. After such an enlightened speech by the gentleman, I think there's hardly anything left for me to speak on design. And I don't think so I have any authority on that. But yet, since I'm into the business of food, and today we are going to display the food for design, which has been designed by Rashid Rana. We never knew that the food is also a design. But nevertheless, after looking at the concept and going through the detail and challenging your intelligence, the amount of things, once you go to a restaurant or to go to a hotel and looking at the menu, just order a dish. But the amount of effort that goes into developing that dish from from the plate itself and from the ingredient that you choose, and then the way you present it to the customer, and also the its color and color scheming. I'll encourage you to sometime go to a bakery and see the amount of pastries and cakes, the way they're being done, and the color combinations that are very, very appetizing for you. I went to Tokyo, and I went to one of these, Japan is coming up big time in the bakeries now. I mean, the best baking being done is now in Japan. So I went to Tokyo, and I was taken to one of the finest bakeries. And here, when you go to the restaurant and the bakery, you see that all the walls and everything is so nicely done. So there is marbles and granites and things like that to welcome you. In that bakery, there were simple white walls and a very nice visi-cooler in which all the pastries and all the developments were being placed. And I asked the gentleman, why so simple? He says, we don't want you to concentrate on anything else but to the design of our food. And that's where the simplicity is the ultimate luxury, has taken its course from Japan. So, gentlemen, today we would like to show you some of the culinary, expertise put in place, and also the way the things are cut. I mean, there are processes in cooking. There are almost 70 to 80 processes in cooking that nobody actually realizes that. And can you imagine that if you are in one house where you are treating to a 10 or 12 guests, how much the effort goes into from the lady of the house and all that. So from salt to any ingredients, any hotel can have a dry store to other stores would have at least thousands of ingredients every day. And not a single ingredient is considered to be missing. When one customer orders one dish, you expect to be given, and you expect that it is given as an excellence. So the culinary delight and the culinary artists around the world are literally to be celebrated. And I would like all of you to think sometime when you go to the restaurant that when you eat and when the plate comes in front of you, it's an art on the plate. And we need to, these are, and you won't see them. They are in the kitchen, they are preparing the food and all that. So a little appreciation would be expected every time that you go to the food eatery and get a nice food to eat. Thank you very much, and I hope that you will like the food that we'll serve today. Bon appetit. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So for the closing ceremony, please allow me to invite and introduce Ma'am Kiran Khan, Executive Director and the driving force behind Design Summit, somebody without whom this event could not have been possible. Kiran Khan, Associate Professor and Head of the Textile, Fashion and Accessories Department at Beacon House National University, holds a bachelor's degree in textile design from NCA and an MSc in linguistics with honors from BNU. Passionate about the language of textiles, she received the prestigious Percy Brown Award for Art History. With international studies in Paris and Tokyo, Khan is recognized for her craft intervention projects, including a UNESCO Craft Capacity Building Initiative in 2021. Notably, she has curated 20 years of BNU textile fiber artists set for international publications, showcasing her 2-decade commitment to the field. Ma'am, please grace the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. ऐसा लग रहा है I've paid all of you to clap for me. Thank you, Sara. This has been an overwhelming time for the Design Summit team as a whole. And on this concluding day, I look back upon the months and months of hard work that has been put together, and I cannot help but be in awe of what we have been able to accomplish together as a team. Towards the end, especially in the last few weeks, we were counting our time in hours and minutes. We had impossible deadlines and many logistical nightmares. Looking at how the entire event, with the support of our DS team, the BNU community, and each and every school has come together, is nothing short of heartwarming. As a pioneer and founding member of BNU, I recall standing at the inauguration of this site 20 years ago. There were no buildings here, so for me, personally, this is an extremely emotional and overwhelming moment. The Design Summit was conceived many years ago as a platform where designers, scholars, academics and industry experts would come together under one platform to collaborate and exchange ideas through dialogue, making, critique, and learning. The aim, of course, was to foster an inclusive space where design could be viewed and understood from a variety of perspectives, understanding the multiple ways in which design lends itself to our daily lives and its implications on our future, and more importantly, the future of the planet. This one-of-a-kind event, however, grew to become far more monumental in nature as first envisioned. I suppose that is inevitable when you put together a team of extremely creative and talented minds together, each more determined and excited than the other. The Design Summit could not have been possible or realized without the invaluable patronage of our collaborators across the many components we put together. First and foremost, the Rhode Island School of Design, RISD Center for Complexity. Ijlal, I am extremely grateful to you. Thank you. It would not have been possible without our venue partner, Punjab Wall Cities Authority, hospitality partner, Hashu Group and Ambiance, Embassy in France, media partners, Mango Vase, Discover Pakistan, Hum TV, Alliance Française. Thank you. The conversation segment was powered by lead sponsor JS Bank and digital arm JS Zindagi, who led a hackathon also. Other partner institutes were also invited to participate in this inclusive dialogue. From Lahore, NCA, PIFD, ComSats, IAC, as well as other BNU faculties, the Razia Hassan School of Architecture, School of Education, School of Computer and IT, and Institute of Psychology. So thank you very much. Our technology-centric simultaneity survey exhibition was put together with the help and generosity of co-lead sponsor I2C and German Embassy in Pakistan. The architectural pavilions would not have been possible without the collaboration from Razia Hassan School of Architecture, IAP Lahore chapter, and the generosity of Miraj Housing Society, as well as sponsors LMKR, I2C, OH&A Design Works, Gourmet Homes and Furnitures, Wood Iconic, Ali Zishan Theatre, Kaisa Hamza and Hum TV. The much adored site-specific exhibition Jugaad was made possible through the patronage of the British Council, with capacity building workshops and some projects supported by Anne Marie Schimmel House, German Cultural Center, Lahore. The grand finale of this summit today, with the faculty and student body involved, will culminate in two unique segments: sound and performance as design, and finally food as design segment, which has been sponsored and curated by the talented Hashu Group. This dream of the Design Summit, led by the creative genius Rashid Rana, has come to life due to the dedication and endless hard work of the entire team that has stood by him and shared this vision. To describe candidly, I would say this ambitious project required us all to drive at full speed, on low fuel, while switching gears on cue. While in the morning we would be fulfilling our duties as teachers, after class we would become curators, planners, finance managers, budget specialists, negotiators, marketing experts, and branding and PR gurus. At least we were trying to be. Often this transition from one role to another was not so linear or simple. It is fair to say we have truly learned what the word simultaneity really means. Fulfilling these roles, although some have been very challenging for us day and night, our families bear testimony to this, we have had to admit that there has been a tremendous amount of learning for all of us, and this is something we will all cherish. It brings me great pride as I reflect back at what we have accomplished together. But what brings real joy is the support and response we have received from the community. Inclusivity lies at the core of what we at BNU stand for, and that was from the very beginning one of the cornerstones of the Design Summit. What we collectively witnessed in the last 2 nights and what we will continue to see over the upcoming days and weeks is a true reflection of that dream being achieved. We owe the success of this summit not only to the team working on the front line, but equally to the people at the back end for the scaffolding this entire process. Thank you to the Central Administrative Office, the Accounts and Registrar Office, the Office of External Affairs, and the Office of Communications and Outreach. Also to all our international participants who traveled all the way to support us. So thank you very much. We are greatly indebted to our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, for all his help and support at all hours. Thank you, sir. Lastly, I have a lot of people to thank, but one person who has been my rock and my support in thick and thin, my assistant curator, Sana Aziz. Please give her a big hand. Sana, if you can stand up, please. Last but not the least is the Design Summit team, my ushers team that has made all this possible. May I request all of you to please stand up. DS team. And let us give them a big round of applause. Thank you, everyone.